Hello, my name is Tom Doyle, and I'm going to be reading to you today from the first part of James Joyce's Ulysses. I was a literature major a long time ago, and of course, James Joyce is one of the high priests of literature, particularly of the modernist branch. And many think of Joyce's Ulysses as the foundational text of modernism. Um, there's been lots said and written about him, as I'm sure you're aware. But there was a fellow by the name of Wyndham Lewis, an Englishman, and he thought that Joyce was really more interested in the how than the why of literary expression. I guess what that means is that Joyce seems to be more interested in describing a scene or seeing a scene in terms of how it's reflected in the characters, rather than seeing the characters reflecting the scene. That's a somewhat general description of modernism. We're going to briefly explore this idea in the readings from the first section, as I said before, in which he explores topics that later on in the whole of the narrative are exposed. The first of these ideas is ritual sacrifice, and of course that occurs in the very beginning scene where Buck Mulligan, I guess you could call him Stephen's housemate, and there's also an Englishman by the name of Haynes. They live in the Martello Tower, which is just outside Dublin, and has a view of the sea, obviously. And this is the very beginning. Stately, plump Buck Mulligan came from the stairhead, bearing a bowl of lather on which a mirror and a razor lay crossed. A yellow dressing gown ungirdled was sustained gently behind him by the mild morning air. He held the bowl aloft and intoned, "En tuibo ad altare Dei." For the Catholics in the group, I'm sure if you're as old as I am, you recognize that as the first phrase in the Tridentine or Latin Mass. It means, "I will go on to the altar of God." And the person assisting at the Mass would say, "Ad Deum qui litigat juventutum meum," to God who giveth joy to my youth. One of my favorite sayings in Latin. So what's the purpose of all this? Well, Buck has a bowl on which a mirror and a razor lay crossed. So most of the textual critics point out crossed as a direct reference to Jesus Christ and the crucifixion. Then the fact that the yellow dressing gown is ungirdled, in other words, no tie around it, and the mild morning air blows it out and back. One can imagine priest coming out, he comes to the bottom of the altar, he bows, he said, "In tuibo ad altare Dei," and then he goes up the steps to say Mass. So what does this have to do with ritual sacrifice? Once again, for those the uninitiated, we Catholics believe that the Catholic Mass is the reenactment of our Lord's passion and death. And what happens in Ulysses, in the longer narrative, of course, we have, in a sense, the sacrifice of Leopold Bloom, who is also thought to be a Jew, as was Jesus Christ. I think that's enough on that. Another topic, in addition to the ritual sacrifice, is that of betrayal. In a larger narrative, Molly betrays her husband, Leopold, with Blazes Boylan, and Leopold Bloom suffers the social scorn of all those around him. Once again, the idea of betrayal. And this, once again, is Mulligan and Buck Mulligan and Stephen talking. And Mulligan notices that Stephen's nose is out of joint, and he doesn't understand why. Then what is it? Buck Mulligan asked impatiently. Cough it up. I'm quite frank with you. What have you against me now? They halted, looking towards the blunt cape of Bray Head, out to the ocean, that lay on the water like the snout of a sleeping whale. Stephen freed his arm quietly. Do you wish me to tell you? He asked. Yes, what is it? Buck Mulligan asked. I don't remember anything. He looked in Stephen's face as he spoke. A light wind passed his brow, fanning softly his fair, uncombed hair, and stirring silver points of anxiety in his eyes. Stephen, depressed by his own voice, said, Do you remember the first day I went to your house after my mother's death? Buck Mulligan frowned quickly and said, What? Where? I can't remember anything. I remember only ideas and sensations. Why? What happened in the name of God? You were making tea, Stephen said. And I went across the landing to get more hot water. Your mother and some visitor came out of the drawing room, and she asked you who was in your room. Yes, Buck Mulligan said. What did I say? I forget. You said, Stephen answered, it's only the Doyles, whose mother is beastly dead. A flush which made him seem younger and more engaging rose to Buck Mulligan's cheek. Did I say that? He asked. Well, what harm is that? He shook his constraint from him nervously. And what is death? He asked. Your mother's or yours or my own? You saw only your mother die. I see them pop off every day. And the Mater and Richmond, two hospitals, Buck is a medical student, and cut up into tripes in the dissecting room. It's a beastly thing and nothing else. It simply doesn't matter. You wouldn't kneel down to pray for your mother on her deathbed when she asked you. Why? Because you have that cursed Jesuit strain in you, only it's injected the wrong way. To me, it's all mockery and beastly. Her cerebral lobes are not functioning. She calls the doctor Sir Peter Teasel and picks buttercups off the quilt. Humor her till it's over. You crossed her last wish in death, and yet you sulk with me because I don't whinge like some hired mute from Lalouette's Absurd. I suppose I did say it. I didn't mean to offend the memory of your mother. He had spoken himself into boldness. Stephen, shielding the gaping wounds, which the words had left in his heart, said very coldly, I'm not thinking of the offense to my mother. Of what then? Buck Mulligan asked. Of the offense to me, Stephen answered. Buck Mulligan swung around on his heel. So we see Stephen feels betrayed by his friend. Now the idea of betrayal, albeit it has more to do with the Irish-English dichotomy, comes up in a conversation with Haynes. Haynes is an Englishman who apparently was at Oxford, where Mulligan was briefly, and he's come to live with them. And Haynes is fascinated with Stephen, because Stephen, of course, is very literary, very witty, and Haynes admires that. Let's see, where are we? So Haynes is speaking. Haynes said, after all, I should think you are able to free yourself. You are your own master, it seems to me. I am the servant of two masters, Stephen said, an English and an Italian. Italian? Haynes said. A crazy old queen, jealous, kneel down before me. And a third, Stephen said. There is, who wants me for odd jobs. Italian? Haynes said again. What do you mean? The Imperial British State, Stephen answered, his color rising, and the Holy Roman Catholic and Apostolic Church. Haynes detached from his underlip some fibers of tobacco before he spoke. I can't quite understand that, he said calmly. An Irishman must think like that, I dare say. We feel in England that we haven't treated you rather unfairly. It seems history is to blame. Of course, the Irish and English have never understood one another, and probably never will. But the point here is that of betrayal. Stephen is his own man, but yet he feels allegiance to both the Catholic Church and to Ireland. And of course, he's very resentful of England. And once again, the theme of betrayal is that of Molly to Leopold Bloom. And this is, as it were, the orchestral introduction of that idea into the whole narrative. And then, just to end up, it seems to me that these two topics are reprised in Stephen's conversation with Mr. Deasy. Mr. Deasy is today we would say, the headmaster at the school where Stephen teaches. Not very willingly. Mr. Deasy recognizes that Stephen is not going to be around forever, that he has greater ambitions than being a teacher. So here, Mr. Deasy is delivering a little talk to Stephen. He's a bit like Polonius in Hamlet. He gives advice, but he's a bit of a hypocrite himself. Mark my words, Mr. Daedalus, he said. England is in the hands of the Jews in all the highest places, for finance or press, and they are the signs of a nation's decay. Wherever they gather, they eat up the nation's vital strength. I've seen it coming these years. As sure as we are standing here, the Jew merchants are already at their work of destruction. Old England is dying. He stepped swiftly off, his eyes coming to blue life as they passed a broad sunbeam. He faced about and back again. Dying, he said, if not dead by now. And then in Stephen's mind, this is interior monologue, the harlot's cry from street to street shall weave old England's winding sheet, making fun, obviously, of Mr. Deasy's fear of the Jews. His eyes opened wide in vision, stared sternly across the sunbeam in which he halted. A merchant, Stephen said, is one who buys cheap and sells dear. Jew or Gentile, is he not? They sinned against the light, Mr. Deasy said gravely, and you can see the darkness in their eyes. And that is why they are wanderers on the earth to this day. The sinning against the light is part of the Gospel of St. John, with which the Tridentine or Catholic Mass ends. And the normal English translation is that the light was sent forth and the darkness grasped it not. And that's an allusion to that here. They sinned against the light. On the steps of the Paris Stock Exchange, the gold-skinned men quoting prices on their gemmed fingers gabble of geese. They swarmed loud, uncouth, about the temple, their heads thick plodding under Maladroit silk hats. Not theirs, these clothes, this speech, these gestures. Their full, slow eyes belied the words, the gestures eager and unoffending, but knew the rancors massed about them and knew their zeal was vain. Vain patience to heap and hoard. Time surely would scatter all. A hoard heaped by the roadside, plundered and passing on. Their eyes knew the years of wandering and, patient, knew the dishonors of their flesh. Who has not? Stephen said. What do you mean, Mr. Deasy asked. He came forward a pace and stood by the table. His underjaw fell sideways, open, uncertainly. In this old wisdom, he waits to hear from me. History, Stephen said, is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake. From the playfield, just prior to this passage, all the boys have taken their recess, and they're out on what they call the hockey field. It's actually hurling, a form of field hockey, played by the Irish. Yeah. From the playfield, the boys raised a shout, a whirring whistle. Goal! What if the nightmare gives you a back kick? The ways of the Creator are not our ways, Mr. Deasy said. All history moves toward one great goal, the manifestation of God. Stephen jerked his thumb toward the window, saying, that is God. And through the window come the sounds of the boys playing. Hooray, aye, we. What? Mr. Deasy asked. A shout in the street, Stephen answered, shrugging his shoulders. Mr. Deasy looked down and held for a while the wings of his nose tweaked between his fingers. Looking up again, he set them free. I am happier than you are, he said. We have committed many errors and many sins. A woman brought sin into the world. For a woman who is no better than she should be, Helen, the runaway wife of Menelaus, 10 years the Greeks made war on Troy. A faithless wife first brought the strangers to our shore here. McMurrow's wife and her leman O'Rourke, Prince of Breffni. A woman too brought Parnell low. That's probably better known than the other allusions. Parnell, of course, was mixed up with a woman called Kitty O'Shea, who was a married woman. The adultery was later discovered, and Parnell was thrown out of the government. And many of the Irish still backed him, even though he was thrown out. They felt the church should keep its nose out of politics. Among them was Joyce. Many errors, many failures, but not the one sin. I am a struggler now at the end of my days, but I will fight for the right till the end. And then Stephen thinks, for Ulster will fight, and Ulster will be right. He's thinking of the Northern Irish, the Anglo-Irish as they're called, who wanted, of course, and still do, be part of Great Britain, whereas the Southern Irish are now a republic, as you know, and had always wanted to reunite the whole of the island. So this discussion goes on, and Mr. Deasy gives Stephen advice about money and other things, and Stephen takes his leave. And as he's leaving the school grounds, Mr. Deasy follows him and shouts, Mr. Dedalus, running after me. No more letters, I hope. Just one moment. Yes, sir, Stephen said, turning back at the gate. Mr. Deasy halted, breathing hard and swallowing his breath. I just wanted to say, he said, Ireland, they say, has the honor of being the only country which never persecuted the Jews. Do you know that? No. And do you know why? He frowned sternly on the bright air. Why, sir? Stephen asked, beginning to smile. Because she never let them in, Mr. Deasy said solemnly. A cough ball of laughter leaped from his throat, dragging after it a rattling chain of phlegm. He turned back quickly, coughing, laughing, his lifted arms waving to the air. "She never let them in," he cried again, through his laughter, as he stamped on gaitered feet over the gravel of the path. "That's why." On his wide shoulders, through the checkerwork of leaves, the sun flung spangles, dancing coins. So Mr. Deasy's quite obvious, blatant, you might say, anti-Semitism, of course, interweaves this idea of the ritual where someone is sacrificed, and then also the idea of betrayal. In Mr. Deasy's version of things, the Jews have betrayed England, and they can't betray Ireland because the Irish won't have it. But all of this, of course, has a larger purpose, it would seem, within the narrative, in that Bloom is a Jew, and Molly is betraying him. And if I just end up with that, that's one of the hallmarks, I think, of modernism, is you get these, as they were, scintilla of ideas that slowly build up to become a key part of the narrative. How does it sound?